the new God of omnipotence, the new gods of omnipotence, the new God of omnipotence, the new goddess of omnipotence, the new goddesses of omnipotence, the new goddess of omnipotence, the old God of omnipotence, the old gods of omnipotence, the old God of omnipotence, the old goddess of omnipotence, the old goddesses of omnipotence, the old goddess of omnipotence, the greater God of omnipotence, the greater gods of omnipotence, the greater God of omnipotence, the greater goddess of omnipotence, the greater goddesses of omnipotence, the greater goddess of omnipotence, the lesser God of omnipotence, the lesser gods of omnipotence, the lesser God of omnipotence, the lesser goddess of omnipotence, the lesser goddesses of omnipotence, the lesser goddess of omnipotence, the higher God of omnipotence, the higher gods of omnipotence, the higher God of omnipotence, the higher goddess of omnipotence, the higher goddesses of omnipotence, the higher goddess of omnipotence, the lower God of omnipotence, the lower gods of omnipotence, the lower God of omnipotence, the lower goddess of omnipotence, the lower goddesses of omnipotence, the lower goddess of omnipotence, the greater spirit of omnipotence, the greater spirits of omnipotence, the greater spirit of omnipotence, the lesser spirit of omnipotence, the lesser spirits of omnipotence, the lesser spirit of omnipotence, the higher spirit of omnipotence, the higher spirits of omnipotence, the higher spirit of omnipotence, the lower spirit of omnipotence, the lower spirits of omnipotence, the lower spirit of omnipotence, the major God of omnipotence, the major gods of omnipotence, the major God of omnipotence, the major goddess of omnipotence, the major goddesses of omnipotence, the major goddess of omnipotence, the minor God of omnipotence, the minor gods of omnipotence, the minor God of omnipotence, the minor goddess of omnipotence, the minor goddesses of omnipotence, the minor goddess of omnipotence, the superior God of omnipotence, the superior gods of omnipotence, the superior God of omnipotence, the superior goddess of omnipotence, the superior goddesses of omnipotence, the superior goddess of omnipotence, the inferior God of omnipotence, the inferior gods of omnipotence, the inferior God of omnipotence, the inferior goddess of omnipotence, the inferior goddesses of omnipotence, the inferior goddess of omnipotence, the ancestor God of omnipotence, the ancestor gods of omnipotence, the ancestor God of omnipotence, the ancestor goddess of omnipotence, the ancestor goddesses of omnipotence, the ancestor goddess of omnipotence, the ascendant God of omnipotence, the ascendant gods of omnipotence, the ascendant God of omnipotence, the ascendant goddess of omnipotence, the ascendant goddesses of omnipotence, the ascendant goddess of omnipotence, the descendant God of omnipotence, the descendant gods of omnipotence, the descendant God of omnipotence, the descendant goddess of omnipotence, the descendant goddesses of omnipotence, the descendant goddess of omnipotence, the transcendent God of omnipotence, the transcendent gods of omnipotence, the transcendent God of omnipotence, the transcendent goddess of omnipotence, the transcendent goddesses of omnipotence, the transcendent goddess of omnipotence, the past God of omnipotence, the past gods of omnipotence, the past God of omnipotence, the past goddess of omnipotence, the past goddesses of omnipotence, the past goddess of omnipotence, the present God of omnipotence, the present gods of omnipotence, the present God of omnipotence, the present goddess of omnipotence, the present goddesses of omnipotence, the present goddess of omnipotence, the future God of omnipotence, the future gods of omnipotence, the future God of omnipotence, the future goddess of omnipotence, the future goddesses of omnipotence, the future goddess of omnipotence, the authentic God of omnipotence, the authentic gods of omnipotence, the authentic God of omnipotence, the authentic goddess of omnipotence, the authentic goddesses of omnipotence, the authentic goddess of omnipotence, the synthetic God of omnipotence, the synthetic gods of omnipotence, the synthetic god of omnipotence, the synthetic goddess of omnipotence, the synthetic goddesses of omnipotence, the synthetic goddess of omnipotence, the progressive god of omnipotence, the progressive gods of omnipotence, the progressive god of omnipotence, the progressive goddess of omnipotence, the progressive goddesses of omnipotence, the progressive goddess of omnipotence, the regressive god of omnipotence, the regressive gods of omnipotence, the regressive god of omnipotence, the regressive goddess of omnipotence, the regressive goddesses of omnipotence, the regressive goddess of omnipotence, the ordinary god of omnipotence, the ordinary gods of omnipotence, the ordinary god of omnipotence, the ordinary goddess of omnipotence, the ordinary goddesses of omnipotence, the ordinary goddess of omnipotence, the extraordinary god of omnipotence, the extraordinary gods of omnipotence, the extraordinary god of omnipotence, the extraordinary goddess of omnipotence, the extraordinary goddesses of omnipotence, the extraordinary goddess of omnipotence, the static god of omnipotence, the static gods of omnipotence, the static god of omnipotence, the static goddess of omnipotence, the static goddesses of omnipotence, the static goddess of omnipotence, the dynamic god of omnipotence, the dynamic gods of omnipotence, the dynamic god of omnipotence, the dynamic goddess of omnipotence, the dynamic goddesses of omnipotence, the dynamic goddess of omnipotence, the land god of omnipotence, the land gods of omnipotence, the land god of omnipotence, the land goddess of omnipotence, the land goddesses of omnipotence, the land goddess of omnipotence, the sea god of omnipotence, the sea gods of omnipotence, the sea god of omnipotence, the sea goddess of omnipotence, the sea goddesses of omnipotence, the sea goddess of omnipotence, the sky god of omnipotence, the sky gods of omnipotence, the sky god of omnipotence, the sky goddess of omnipotence, the sky goddesses of omnipotence, the sky goddess of omnipotence, the god of omnipotence, the gods of omnipotence, the god of omnipotence, the goddess of omnipotence, the goddesses of omnipotence, the goddess of omnipotence, the half god of omnipotence, the half gods of omnipotence, the half god of omnipotence, the half goddess of omnipotence, the half goddesses of omnipotence, the half goddess of omnipotence, the vessel of omnipotence, the vessels of omnipotence, the vessel of omnipotence, the name of omnipotence, the names of omnipotence, the name of omnipotence, the person of omnipotence, the persons of omnipotence, the person of omnipotence, the persona of omnipotence, the personas of omnipotence, the persona of omnipotence, the personage of omnipotence, the personages of omnipotence, the personage of omnipotence, the personality of omnipotence, the personalities of omnipotence, the personality of omnipotence, the personification of omnipotence, the personifications of omnipotence, the personification of omnipotence, the image of omnipotence, the images of omnipotence, the image of omnipotence, the imagination of omnipotence, the imaginations of omnipotence, the imagination of omnipotence, the belief of omnipotence, the beliefs of omnipotence, the belief of omnipotence, the thought of omnipotence, the thoughts of omnipotence, the thought of omnipotence, the word of omnipotence, the words of omnipotence, the word of omnipotence, the action of omnipotence, the actions of omnipotence, the action of omnipotence, the reaction of omnipotence, the reactions of omnipotence, the reaction of omnipotence, the feeling of omnipotence, the feelings of omnipotence, the feeling of omnipotence, the situation of omnipotence, the situations of omnipotence, the situation of omnipotence, the circumstance of omnipotence, the circumstances of omnipotence, the circumstance of omnipotence, the environment of omnipotence, the environments of omnipotence, the environment of omnipotence, the relationship of omnipotence, the relationships of omnipotence, the relationship of omnipotence, The number of omnipotence. The numbers of omnipotence. The number of omnipotence. The formula of omnipotence. The formulas of omnipotence. The formula of omnipotence. The equation of omnipotence. The equations of omnipotence. The equation of omnipotence. The theory of omnipotence. The theories of omnipotence. The theory of omnipotence. The symbol of omnipotence. The symbols of omnipotence. The symbol of omnipotence. The color of omnipotence. The colors of omnipotence. The color of omnipotence. The thing of omnipotence. The things of omnipotence. The thing of omnipotence. The way of omnipotence. The ways of omnipotence. The way of omnipotence. The place of omnipotence. The places of omnipotence. The place of omnipotence. The time of omnipotence. The times of omnipotence. The time of omnipotence. The event of omnipotence. The events of omnipotence. The event of omnipotence. The result of omnipotence. The results of omnipotence. The result of omnipotence. The crown of omnipotence. The crowns of omnipotence. The crown of omnipotence. The throne of omnipotence. The thrones of omnipotence. The throne of omnipotence. The omnipotent king. The omnipotent kings. The omnipotence kingdom. The omnipotence kingdoms. The omnipotence king subject. The omnipotence king subjects. The omnipotence king's dominion. The omnipotence king's dominions. The kingdom of omnipotence. The kingdoms of omnipotence. The kingdom of omnipotence. The omnipotence queen. The omnipotence queens. The omnipotence queendom. The omnipotence queendoms. The omnipotence queen subject. The omnipotence queen subjects. The omnipotence queen's dominion. The omnipotence queen's dominions. The queendom of omnipotence. The queendoms of omnipotence. The queendom of omnipotence. The omnipotent prince. The omnipotent princes. The omnipotence princedom. The omnipotence princedoms. The omnipotence princes subject. The omnipotence princes subjects. The omnipotence princes dominion. The omnipotence princes dominions. The princedom of omnipotence. The princedoms of omnipotence. The princedom of omnipotence. The omnipotence princess. The omnipotence princesses. The omnipotence princessdom. The omnipotence princessdoms. The omnipotence princesses subject. The omnipotence princesses subjects. The omnipotence princesses dominion. The omnipotence princesses dominions. The princessdom of omnipotence. The princessdoms of omnipotence. The princessdom of omnipotence. The lord of omnipotence. The lords of omnipotence. The lord of omnipotence. The lordess of omnipotence. The lordesses of omnipotence. The lordess of omnipotence. The priest of omnipotence. The priests of omnipotence. The priest of omnipotence. The priestess of omnipotence. The priestesses of omnipotence. The priestess of omnipotence. The ritual of omnipotence. The rituals of omnipotence. The ritual of omnipotence. The shrine of omnipotence. The shrines of omnipotence. The shrine of omnipotence. The temple of omnipotence. The temples of omnipotence. The temple of omnipotence. The leader of omnipotence. The leaders of omnipotence. The leader of omnipotence. The follower of omnipotence. The followers of omnipotence. The follower of omnipotence. The natural substance of omnipotence. The natural substances of omnipotence. The natural substance of omnipotence. The supernatural substance of omnipotence. The supernatural substances of omnipotence. The supernatural substance of omnipotence. The temporal substance of omnipotence. The temporal substances of omnipotence. The temporal substance of omnipotence. The spiritual substance of omnipotence. The spiritual substances of omnipotence. The spiritual substance of omnipotence. The natural form of omnipotence. The natural forms of omnipotence. The natural form of omnipotence. The supernatural form of omnipotence. The supernatural forms of omnipotence. The supernatural form of omnipotence. The temporal form of omnipotence. The temporal forms of omnipotence. the temporal form of omnipotence, the spiritual form of omnipotence, the spiritual forms of omnipotence, the spiritual form of omnipotence, the age of omnipotence, the ages of omnipotence, the age of omnipotence, the era of omnipotence, the eras of omnipotence, the era of omnipotence, the awakener of omnipotence, the awakeners of omnipotence, the awakener of omnipotence, the awakening of omnipotence, the awakenings of omnipotence, the awakening of omnipotence, the realm of omnipotence, the realms of omnipotence, the realm of omnipotence, the dimension of omnipotence, the dimensions of omnipotence, the dimension of omnipotence, the zone of omnipotence, the zones of omnipotence, the zone of omnipotence, the frequency of omnipotence, the frequencies of omnipotence, the frequency of omnipotence, the century of omnipotence, the centuries of omnipotence, the century of omnipotence, the millennium of omnipotence, the millenniums of omnipotence, the millennium of omnipotence, the purpose of omnipotence, the purposes of omnipotence, the purpose of omnipotence, the meaning of omnipotence, the meanings of omnipotence, the meaning of omnipotence, the culture of omnipotence, the cultures of omnipotence, the culture of omnipotence, the demonstrator of omnipotence, the demonstrators of omnipotence, the demonstrator of omnipotence, the demonstration of omnipotence, the demonstrations of omnipotence, the demonstration of omnipotence, the manifester of omnipotence, the manifestors of omnipotence, the manifester of omnipotence, the manifestation of omnipotence, the manifestations of omnipotence, the manifestation of omnipotence, the presence of omnipotence, the presences of omnipotence, the presence of omnipotence, the glow of omnipotence, the glows of omnipotence, the glow of omnipotence, the goal of omnipotence, the goals of omnipotence, the goal of omnipotence, the plan of omnipotence, the plans of omnipotence, the plan of omnipotence, the book of omnipotence, the books of omnipotence, the book of omnipotence, the philosopher of omnipotence, the philosophers of omnipotence, the philosopher of omnipotence, the philosophy of omnipotence, the philosophies of omnipotence, the philosophy of omnipotence, the releaser of omnipotence, the releasers of omnipotence, the releaser of omnipotence, the release of omnipotence, the releases of omnipotence, the release of omnipotence, the variable of omnipotence, the variables of omnipotence, the variable of omnipotence, the cause of omnipotence, the causes of omnipotence, the cause of omnipotence, the effect of omnipotence, the effects of omnipotence, the effect of omnipotence, the journey of omnipotence, the journeys of omnipotence, the journey of omnipotence, the emergence of omnipotence, the emergences of omnipotence, the emergence of omnipotence, the source of omnipotence, the sources of omnipotence, the source of omnipotence, the originator of omnipotence, the originators of omnipotence, the originator of omnipotence, the origin of omnipotence, the origins of omnipotence, the origin of omnipotence, the forefather of omnipotence, the forefathers of omnipotence, the forefather of omnipotence, the foremother of omnipotence, the foremothers of omnipotence, the foremother of omnipotence, the ancestor of omnipotence, the ancestors of omnipotence, the ancestor of omnipotence, the descendant of omnipotence, the descendants of omnipotence, the descendant of omnipotence, the lineage of omnipotence, the lineages of omnipotence, the lineage of omnipotence, the heritage of omnipotence, the heritages of omnipotence, the heritage of omnipotence, the heir of omnipotence, the heirs of omnipotence, the heir of omnipotence, the co-heir of omnipotence, the co-heirs of omnipotence, the co-heir of omnipotence, the joint heir of omnipotence, the joint heirs of omnipotence, the joint heir of omnipotence, the dynasty of omnipotence, the dynasties of omnipotence, the dynasty of omnipotence, the force of omnipotence, the forces of omnipotence, the force of omnipotence, the law of omnipotence, The laws of omnipotence. The law of omnipotence. The pact of omnipotence. The pacts of omnipotence. The pact of omnipotence. The game of omnipotence. The games of omnipotence. The game of omnipotence. The mask of omnipotence. The masks of omnipotence. The mask of omnipotence. The armor of omnipotence. The armors of omnipotence. The armor of omnipotence. The sword of omnipotence. The swords of omnipotence. The sword of omnipotence. The shield of omnipotence. The shields of omnipotence. The shield of omnipotence. The force shield of omnipotence. The force shields of omnipotence. The force shield of omnipotence. The armored force shield of omnipotence. The armored force shields of omnipotence. The armored force shield of omnipotence. The champion of omnipotence. The champions of omnipotence. The champion of omnipotence. The guardian of omnipotence. The guardians of omnipotence. The guardian of omnipotence. The defender of omnipotence. The defenders of omnipotence. The defender of omnipotence. The protector of omnipotence. The protectors of omnipotence. The protector of omnipotence. The chant of omnipotence. The chants of omnipotence. The chant of omnipotence. The shape of omnipotence. The shapes of omnipotence. The shape of omnipotence. The cube of omnipotence. The cubes of omnipotence. The cube of omnipotence. The cuboid of omnipotence. The cuboids of omnipotence. The cuboid of omnipotence. The sphere of omnipotence. The spheres of omnipotence. The sphere of omnipotence. The spheroid of omnipotence. The spheroids of omnipotence. The spheroid of omnipotence. The prism of omnipotence. The prisms of omnipotence. The prism of omnipotence. The pyramid of omnipotence. The pyramids of omnipotence. The pyramid of omnipotence. The cylinder of omnipotence. The cylinders of omnipotence. The cylinder of omnipotence. The cone of omnipotence. The cones of omnipotence. The cone of omnipotence. The triangle of omnipotence. The triangles of omnipotence. The triangle of omnipotence. The circle of omnipotence. The circles of omnipotence. The circle of omnipotence. The semicircle of omnipotence. The semicircles of omnipotence. The semicircle of omnipotence. The square of omnipotence. The squares of omnipotence. The square of omnipotence. The rectangle of omnipotence. The rectangles of omnipotence. The rectangle of omnipotence. The parallelogram of omnipotence. The parallelograms of omnipotence. The parallelogram of omnipotence. The rhombus of omnipotence. The rhombuses of omnipotence. The rhombus of omnipotence. The trapezoid of omnipotence. The trapezoids of omnipotence. The trapezoid of omnipotence. The polygon of omnipotence. The polygons of omnipotence. The polygon of omnipotence. The pentagon of omnipotence. The pentagons of omnipotence. The pentagon of omnipotence. The hexagon of omnipotence. The hexagons of omnipotence. The hexagon of omnipotence. The septagon of omnipotence. The septagons of omnipotence. The septagon of omnipotence. The octagon of omnipotence. The octagons of omnipotence. The octagon of omnipotence. The nonagon of omnipotence. The nonagons of omnipotence. The nonagon of omnipotence. The decagon of omnipotence. The decagons of omnipotence. The decagon of omnipotence. The evolution of omnipotence. The evolutions of omnipotence. The evolution of omnipotence. The revolution of omnipotence. The revolutions of omnipotence. The revolution of omnipotence. The elemental art of omnipotence. The elemental arts of omnipotence. The elemental art of omnipotence. The elemental science of omnipotence. The elemental sciences of omnipotence. The elemental science of omnipotence. The elemental principle of omnipotence. The elemental principles of omnipotence. The elemental principle of omnipotence. The elemental technology of omnipotence. The elemental technologies of omnipotence. The elemental technology of omnipotence. The low elemental art of omnipotence. The low elemental arts of omnipotence. The low elemental art of omnipotence. The low elemental science of omnipotence. The low elemental sciences of omnipotence. The low elemental science of omnipotence. The low elemental principle of omnipotence. The low elemental principles of omnipotence. The low elemental principle of omnipotence. The low elemental technology of omnipotence. The low elemental technologies of omnipotence. The low elemental technology of omnipotence. The high elemental art of omnipotence. The high elemental arts of omnipotence. The high elemental art of omnipotence. The high elemental science of omnipotence. The high elemental sciences of omnipotence. The high elemental science of omnipotence. The high elemental principle of omnipotence. The high elemental principles of omnipotence. The high elemental principle of omnipotence. The high elemental technology of omnipotence. The high elemental technologies of omnipotence. The high elemental technology of omnipotence. The agent of omnipotence. The agents of omnipotence. The agent of omnipotence. The agency of omnipotence. The agencies of omnipotence. The agency of omnipotence. The amplifier of omnipotence. The amplifiers of omnipotence. The amplifier of omnipotence. The amplification of omnipotence. The amplifications of omnipotence. The amplification of omnipotence. The enhancer of omnipotence. The enhancers of omnipotence. The enhancer of omnipotence. The enhancement of omnipotence. The enhancements of omnipotence. The enhancement of omnipotence. The magnifier of omnipotence. The magnifiers of omnipotence. The magnifier of omnipotence. The magnification of omnipotence. The magnifications of omnipotence. The magnification of omnipotence. The influencer of omnipotence. The influencers of omnipotence. The influencer of omnipotence. The influence of omnipotence. The influences of omnipotence. The influence of omnipotence. The emanator of omnipotence. The emanators of omnipotence. The emanator of omnipotence. The emanation of omnipotence. The emanations of omnipotence. The emanation of omnipotence. The converger of omnipotence. The convergers of omnipotence. The converger of omnipotence. The convergence of omnipotence. The convergences of omnipotence. The convergence of omnipotence. The aura of omnipotence. The auras of omnipotence. The aura of omnipotence. The impression of omnipotence. The impressions of omnipotence. The impression of omnipotence. The intelligence of omnipotence. The intelligences of omnipotence. The intelligence of omnipotence. The sophistication of omnipotence. The sophistications of omnipotence. The sophistication of omnipotence. The genius of omnipotence. The geniuses of omnipotence. The genius of omnipotence. The polymath of omnipotence. The polymaths of omnipotence. The polymath of omnipotence. The psychic of omnipotence. The psychics of omnipotence. The psychic of omnipotence. The knowledge of omnipotence. The knowledges of omnipotence. The knowledge of omnipotence. The understanding of omnipotence. The understandings of omnipotence. The understanding of omnipotence. The wisdom of omnipotence. The wisdoms of omnipotence. The wisdom of omnipotence. The secret of omnipotence. The secrets of omnipotence. The secret of omnipotence. The mystery of omnipotence. The mysteries of omnipotence. The mystery of omnipotence. The revelation of omnipotence. The revelations of omnipotence. The revelation of omnipotence. The tactic of omnipotence. The tactics of omnipotence. The tactic of omnipotence. The strategy of omnipotence. The strategies of omnipotence. The strategy of omnipotence. The strength of omnipotence. The strengths of omnipotence. The strength of omnipotence. The might of omnipotence. The mights of omnipotence. The might of omnipotence. The power of omnipotence. The powers of omnipotence. The power of omnipotence. The authority of omnipotence. The authorities of omnipotence. The authority of omnipotence. The dominion of omnipotence. The dominions of omnipotence. The dominion of omnipotence. The rhythm of omnipotence. The rhythms of omnipotence. The rhythm of omnipotence. the melody of omnipotence, the melodies of omnipotence, the melody of omnipotence, the music of omnipotence, the musics of omnipotence, the music of omnipotence, the lyric of omnipotence, the lyrics of omnipotence, the lyric of omnipotence, the song of omnipotence, the songs of omnipotence, the song of omnipotence, the dance of omnipotence, the dances of omnipotence, the dance of omnipotence, the spirit of omnipotence, the spirits of omnipotence, the spirit of omnipotence, the soul of omnipotence, the souls of omnipotence, the soul of omnipotence, the body of omnipotence, the bodies of omnipotence, the body of omnipotence, the mark of omnipotence, the marks of omnipotence, the mark of omnipotence, the promise of omnipotence, the promises of omnipotence, the promise of omnipotence, the visionary of omnipotence, the visionaries of omnipotence, the visionary of omnipotence, the vision of omnipotence, the visions of omnipotence, the vision of omnipotence, the picture of omnipotence, the pictures of omnipotence, the picture of omnipotence, the sound of omnipotence, the sounds of omnipotence, the sound of omnipotence, the tongue of omnipotence, the tongues of omnipotence, the tongue of omnipotence, the language of omnipotence, the languages of omnipotence, the language of omnipotence, the communication of omnipotence, the communications of omnipotence, the communication of omnipotence, the people of omnipotence, the peoples of omnipotence, the people of omnipotence, the society of omnipotence, the societies of omnipotence, the society of omnipotence, the fortress of omnipotence, the fortresses of omnipotence, the fortress of omnipotence, the government of omnipotence, the governments of omnipotence, the government of omnipotence, the city of omnipotence, the cities of omnipotence, the city of omnipotence, the nation of omnipotence, the nations of omnipotence, the nation of omnipotence, the civilization of omnipotence, the civilizations of omnipotence, the civilization of omnipotence, the world of omnipotence, the worlds of omnipotence, the world of omnipotence,